Thank you very much. It's great to be with everyone here. It's an honor to be at the Carter Center, my first visit here. I've done events with the Baker Institute before, so it's great to see all those aligned with the Baker Institute and make my first visit here. The obligation of a moderator is to talk less and listen more. I promise to do that, but I want to share a joke with you relevant to what David Becker was talking about. I'm cribbing from the Gridiron Dinner. I didn't write the joke, I didn't tell the joke, but President Biden did. I think you'll enjoy it. President Biden, in a video to the Gridiron Dinner, said, you know, one Democrat in the House said, no one elected me to be FDR. That's right. FDR won Georgia 4 times. I've only won it 3 times. The question for this panel is, can an American presidential election be stolen? That's kind of a grabber, so I'm going to hold that off for just a few minutes. We'll get to that, I promise you. But I want to have an opening question that talks about what I think is the existential environment all of you live in and have lived in for the last couple of years. David talked about the statistics of the 2020 election. He and I spent a lot of time thinking about that. I'll give you a very teeny commercial. We have a book coming out in September about all those issues. And I think the 2020 election should be something that Americans ought to celebrate. Not the outcome, but the ingenuity, the creativity, the perseverance, the volunteerism, all of the things that we love and admire about our country justifiably were present, visible, and executed to bring that election to the conclusion that it brought and the success that it brought. Again, not the outcome, but just the way that it happened. We had a pandemic and we had a volatile set of voting procedures that had to be arranged around the pandemic. We also had an enormous, unexpected changeover in election volunteers. People who had been election workers because they were in the age of particular vulnerability to the pandemic, understandably opted out. We had to train a brand new generation of election workers on Zoom with very little human interaction and a very complex set of rules and procedures, and we did it. I know this because my eldest daughter, for the first time, was a poll worker in 2020. She did that because her grandmother, my mother, was a poll worker for 25 years. She was carrying on that generational commitment to democracy. And like David, I get a little misty-eyed when I talk about this. So we have this thing that happened. It ought to be viewed as one of these achievements that are American. And yet, about half of our country thinks a crime was committed of some kind or another. We'll get to the can American presidential election be stolen, I promise. But I want to start with you, Matt. Let's come this way. What is this environment like? How have you personally experienced it? And do you see any way to have a conversation more productive than we are currently having about what happened actually, as opposed to what happened in imagination?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. The Carter Center, Baker Foundation, and those who organized this event. Thank you. Most of the time people can hear me. Also, I appreciate you starting with a joke because I feel like we're on between two ferns. But in all seriousness, what's happened to election officials, election workers during and after the 2020 presidential election, ongoing to this day, as David noted, is a trauma. They've literally been through a traumatic experience. As I've been fortunate to get out, meet with and engage with election officials like Al and Natalie and others, they tear up. They experience it together as they share the stories. My experience was one where I had some threats, some targeting, but nothing like so many of the election officials out across the country who saw their families threatened, who saw their workers threatened, who saw their children brought into the discussion, all for doing their job, doing it well, risking their own health and safety in order to administer our democracy. And so it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that these people that care so deeply about their job and honestly don't care at all who wins, just want to, I frequently say, an election official knows that they did a good job when their name shows up nowhere in the newspaper the next day, right? That's how they know, right? And the remarkable work that they did throughout 2020, as you noted, the resource and ingenuity, turning to distillers to help provide hand sanitizer, right? Creating their own protective shields in polling places, building them themselves, right, in the off hours in order to protect their voters and their workers. And the thanks that they got in return was being accused of being liars, cheaters, and crooks. And it's vile, it's disgusting, and it's so anti-American. It is so against everything who we are. And so as you posit at the end, can we have a better discussion? Yeah, and it starts by recognizing that this election was secure, it was administered with integrity, and the results are correct. That's how this conversation has to start. Then we can get into where challenges were found. The fact that election officials were left to their own devices in many cases to deal with a global pandemic because we didn't have an emergency response system that supported them. That's a conversation we should be having. They need that. They deal with emergencies all the time and have to make up these solutions. Maybe we should support them a little better in anticipation of more and more of these things happening. But it has to start with the truth. It has to start with a recognition of the incredible work they did and the incredible accuracy and integrity of this 2020 election, or it's not a conversation at all. It's a lie, it's a grift, and it's unproductive.
I think you need to pass the microphone on. I don't know, but Al, you want to give it a go?
Yeah, I don't I don't know if you can hear me fine with or without the microphone.
Can you hear him okay? Okay, great. All right.
David had my mic turned off. That's smart.
I would say, one thing that's really been remarkable through it all is that while I think election administrators see so much division out there, so many people in our country believe that the election was stolen, so many others know it was not stolen. But when you're around other election administrators from big cities and small rural counties, in red states and blue states, there's hardly any division about what any of us know. And in terms of the truth and the fact that the 2020 election was the most safe and secure election, it was free and fair, but also what they experienced as a result of the sort of deranged political propaganda and deception that people have been subjected to. Because it's not just Democratic or Republican election administrators that are on the receiving end of where these sort of lies and this paranoid fantasy of a stolen election, when it manifests itself in whether it's violent threats to election administrators, again, Republicans, Democrats, big cities, small counties, but people acting out as a result of it. And acting out as a result on January 6th, or acting out, in our case in Philadelphia, we had 2 men drive up from Virginia and were arrested outside of the Pennsylvania Convention Center where our election operations were consolidated with guns and weapons, lockpick tools, and all the rest to head off a imaginary truckload of counterfeit Chinese ballots that were going to be smuggled in to Philadelphia by South Philly Italian organized crime figures. It's the stupidest thing in the world. And it's hard to confront it, and it's hard to confront it in a way and not make the mistake that I just did. And the mistake that I just made was to dismiss and condescend to people who think these things, because it's going to be impossible to communicate to them if they're speaking the way that I just inadvertently and sincerely spoke. Regardless, and that's what's so frustrating about it, is that it hasn't seemed to have gotten any better since 2020. It seems to have solidified since 2020, and not even the events of January 6th kind of broke that fever.
Natalie?
Thank you. Oh, good. You can hear me.
Yeah.
I think about my experience in the 2020 election a lot. But it really all starts for me when the state of California shut down completely. And there were a list of essential workers that the state had articulated. I mean, these people are essential. These functions cannot shut down. One of them was elections, and the other one was on the other side of my office, which is recording services. There were a lot of people buying their homes, or in some cases in my county, second homes, and we remained pretty busy. So while most of the United States was sort of sheltered in place, I was going to work every single day. And throughout the time that we shut down, leading up to the November election, you get more phone calls from voters who are deeply worried about where our democracy is going. And some of them, unfortunately, take their anger, take their frustrations out on our people. That, it's not new that people will call us upset. They usually don't give us a call when they're like, oh yeah, you're doing great, and we just wanted to let you know. But the tone and the tenor was different, because all of a sudden people are at home, they are more able to watch the news, pay attention to social media, and are tracking all of the mis and disinformation about COVID-19, about elections. And it was this sort of strange intersection of people angry that we were sending everybody a ballot by mail, even though my county had been sending every registered and active voter a ballot since 2018. We also had a number of something called public safety power shutoffs, or PSPS, because we have PG&E, and wildfire is sort of high danger in my county as well. So there were a lot of factors to consider. And I was therefore surprised when, election day came and I had almost no phone calls. It was kind of quiet, and I'm going, when is the other shoe going to drop? It was a great day. There were very few problems on election day. In-person voting went smoothly for the most part, absent some incidents in person where, people were upset that they didn't understand why they couldn't wear their Trump button or their Biden hat, or, the electioneering is always sort of a question with people. It was really after the 2020 election where I and my staff started to feel the harassment, the intimidation, the name calling. To this day, I get Public Records Act requests, which in my state are our version of FOIA requests, asking about the ballots, asking for something called the cast vote record. They want to have all of the in-person materials, which are sealed. Ballots, election materials, they are all sealed and locked away in the case of the 2020 election for 22 months. And a lot of that animosity from our voters, a lot of the sort of myths about the election flowed into the 2021 California gubernatorial recall, where a lot of my election workers are calling us in tears because they don't understand why their friends and their neighbors are accusing them of cheating, accusing my office of cheating. They have not seen that kind of hostility before, and I think it is affecting the way we are trying to sort of recruit people who are sort of now understandably hesitant to serve. We also are trying to make our office even more transparent than ever before. Yeah, I am a little worried about the June election. Not really the sort of process, because we run good elections in my county. It's the fallout and the result of what is going to happen and what that really means for future elections.
The Baker-Carter Commission report was bipartisan. It did try to create a dialogue and a conversation that allowed for a lot of different points of view, distilled them as best as possible. And I was listening to Paige talking about concerns that were present in 2005, and they struck me as almost quaint compared to where we are now. How much I wish we could go back to just general anxiety, low-level concerns, instead of this great sense of volatility we have. And Al, you said something a second ago, and I want to give each and every one of you a chance to do something on your own. You said you inadvertently condescended. And look, one of the more difficult aspects of political communication is not just presentation, but persuasion. I mean, you have to take people who are not with you, who are not prone in an audience to nod their head, and if you can, by the end, get them to nod their head. So each of you, I want to just give you an opportunity to take that audience of imagined or real skeptics that you've dealt with, they're watching online, on social media, they're here, and give them your best pitch as to why their doubts should be recontextualized or thought about in a slightly different way, that doesn't condescend, that tries to say, look, you have energy, you care about democracy, you're involved, you're paying attention. Matt?
Oh, I thought you were going to start with Al. No. So for me, it starts with recognizing that doubts in this system, questions in this system are good and healthy. It's okay. It's good to ask questions. Election officials across this country, across the 8,800 jurisdictions that administer elections, welcome that. Part of running elections in the United States across all 50 states is that the process is bipartisan or multipartisan, that there's involvement for the political parties in the process across the states. It's not just election administrators doing what they want. There are laws that apply that then observers, political observers from both parties or multiple parties can watch, which leads to the second thing that all 50 states and the 5 territories have, which is transparency. We demand our elections be transparent. We demand that the counting of votes, that the auditing of votes, that the processes that Al and Natalie follow are public and transparent. And you see that across the jurisdictions that run elections, where you can participate as an observer. You can certainly participate as a poll worker. Poll workers in most states are bipartisan, right? So there's an opportunity to have your questions answered in the most direct way possible. We run elections at the state and local level so that you can engage directly with the process, so that you can have those doubts and questions answered by being a part of the process, and at the same time serving your community and being part of our democracy. And so for those who have questions, who have doubts, you have the opportunity to engage directly with those that run elections. They live and work in your community. They're professionals that do this for a living that you can engage directly with. This is not some higher level process that the federal government's throwing out there. This is part of each and every community across the United States. And so I would welcome the questions. What isn't productive, and I would challenge them to approach differently, is showing up and threatening that official in your jurisdiction, showing up and accusing them without knowing the process or being directly involved, automatically guarantees a defensive response to protect themselves and their staff. Instead, you're invited in a welcoming way to serve your community as part of the process, right? And so you don't have to take my word for it, or Al's word for it, or Natalie's word for it, or anyone else's word for it, because the process is right there in front of you in a bipartisan, transparent way, administered by professionals, and you have the chance to get involved directly in it. And so that's what I would challenge, is that ability to get involved is intentional. It is an important characteristic of our system, and you do not have to take anyone's word for it, because it's right there for you in your community.
Al?
There is an expression that I think about all the time, and I should bother to figure out who came up with it, but that it's a lot easier to fool someone than to convince someone that they've been fooled. And I think that's a big challenge in communicating right now, because it's not just a matter of a difference of opinion. I think we're confronting something that is much bigger than a difference of opinion, and something that is really very sort of deep and widespread, because as much as I'd like to blame the former president for creating this whole environment, and he's certainly to blame for sort of exploiting it, whatever it was around well before he did this, that made people so receptive. Good people, decent people, intelligent people, so willingly deceived into believing something that that is categorically and empirically untrue. And it is really like one of those situations where you're saying, who do you want to believe, me or your own lying eyes? Like, our observers in the convention center, Republicans, Democrats, Trump campaign, Biden campaign, Greens, voter verifiable paper ballots, every ballot cast in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, either by mail or in person on election day, the voter verifies that they're their selections. It's human readable, ink on paper names that they themselves can see and they cast and are included in not just one, but both of our audits, because we audit every election twice in our county and almost all counties in Pennsylvania. So, we've been at this for a while. I forgot what number of days it is that David said. I don't know that we
543.
but whose count? It feels many times. It feels like yesterday, since so much, especially in Pennsylvania, we have an open seat for governor, open state seat for Senate, and so much of it is jockeying around who can ingratiate themselves the most to the former president, and to do it by parroting these lies about a stolen election.
Natalie?
I have a little bit of a different perspective.
Sure.
Because I do tell people all the time, listen, my job is not to change your worldview. Mm-hmm. I already have a full-time job, and it is to run elections and be the clerk recorder. However, just to sort of build off of what Matt was saying, you can come into the process at any time and see what it is that we're doing. I carry around my elections code with me constantly. Let's go over the laws. Let's sort of sit down and, you can ask me the hard questions. I can't guarantee that I'm going to convince you, but I can 100% guarantee that I will tell you the truth. From how we conduct voter registration, how we do voter list maintenance, through how we build a ballot, through how we do pre-election logic and accuracy testing, how we go about verifying all of the vote by mail, how we set up in-person voting, and how we do the audit. All of these processes are open to the public. And when people have questions, I say, great, I invite your questions. Come in, see how it works. I'm happy to sit down with people. The unfortunate thing is very few people take me up on that offer. But what is great is we have something called an election observer panel that we sort of invite the Republicans, the Democrats, and any interested organizations that either work closely with us or are sort of interested in our elections work. We tell them this is what the dates are where we're doing logic and accuracy testing. This is the date where we start the elections canvass. This is the date where we start the post-election audit. This is very open to everybody, and the parties do come and they do have observers. I can only hope that they are spreading the good word about what we are doing, and I've gotten some good feedback actually from the county Republicans in particular who do come frequently, and they ask the hard questions. I give answers, and I think that that's been a pretty productive relationship. I hope that it gets out into the community, and I have 75,000 voters. I wish the whole state of California, everyone could, sort of feel invited and feel welcomed into the process.
Yes.
Can I just quickly? Natalie brings up a really good point that, that I don't know, a phrase of 2020, 2021 is doing your own research, right? Oh, I'm going to do my own research. Well, in this case, you can talk directly to the people to do your own research that run the process. It is healthy for democracy to show up at Natalie's logic and accuracy testing or engage in the conversation. What is not healthy is taking your election advice from CodeMonkey online and building that out. That is not research, that is propaganda. Natalie has actual facts and information about the process, and it's readily available there for you.
Now to the grabber question for this panel. Can an American election be stolen? In theory, the answer is what? Matt?
No.
Okay. Al?
How'd I do?
Al?
Not through votes cast by registered voters, but I think we're sort of recently getting a glimpse that there is more than one way to steal an election, so I'm kind of interpreting your question a little more broadly.
I want you to.
But in terms of votes cast by voters now.
Natalie,
I'm going to give you the long, annoying answer.
please.
So, stolen election. I mean, just from me and my vantage point, I want to know what that means
What
to
that
people.
means, exactly.
So, is it in-person voter fraud? Is it some sort of process about vote by mail that we're talking about? Are we talking about voting machines that have been hacked? Are we talking about professionals like me just sort of filling in ballots and sort of stuffing our own ballot boxes? So I want to know what all of that means. But if it means any one of these things, I would say very unlikely to steal an election.
And Matt, you mentioned that number, about 8,800 jurisdictions across the country. Explain why that matters in the context of this fundamental question.
Yeah, absolutely. So the decentralized nature of our elections in the United States is a strength when it comes to both identification of possible malfeasance, right? We are closer to the problem. We have local election administrators that know their community, know literally their addresses, their streets, all of that, to understand that if someone's attempting, fraudulent activity and or attempting to mess with the process, they are intimately involved with each and every detail and know their community and process so closely that early identification of any possible problems and mitigation is there. So that the ability, and this goes to the point, the answer is no in an undetected way. It's going to be detected because of all, and Natalie and Al can get into all the multiple controls that are in place to ensure identification of these problems and remediation of them before it can have the kind of impact that you're talking about, where a statewide election, certainly a national election, could be stolen administratively, through fraudulent activity or otherwise, and the checks that are in place, no one person is in control of the process at any given time, and everyone gets to watch it as it's going on, right? And so those controls. Now, I'll give you a little bit of my perspective too, from the national level, having been at the Department of Homeland Security at CISA, working with those 8,800, you have all different voting systems, all different software, all different voter reg systems, all different e-poll books across not just the states, but in many cases, the counties, the townships, and the cities, right? So there's no one single target. There's no one single system that could be exploited in order to manipulate the result of an election in that way. And on top of that, you have a relationship between the local, the state, and the federal government from a cybersecurity, election security perspective, where literally we're in touch with thousands of local jurisdictions in the lead up to and on election day, looking for any types of those problems to be able to quickly identify and resolve it.
And with the audience's indulgence, I'm going to dig a little deeper with what Matt just said, because I think it's really important for the broader audience on the look-in and on social media. So explain what CISA is, say the acronym.
Yep, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency.
Right. And back in 2016, as I understand it, there was an effort to have the federal government engage with the states, and there was some resistance to the states, like, hey, feds, get out of our business.
Yeah. So,
and then between 2016 and 2020, there was a better conversation, a little bit more interaction. Walk the audience through that a little bit, because I think it's important.
Sure. I appreciate it's appropriate we're here in Georgia for that question, because in January 2017, coming out of the 2016 election and the Russian interference, election systems were declared part of our nation's critical infrastructure by the then Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, which means that elections officials, election systems get prioritized support and information sharing from the federal government. What it does not mean is the federal government is now running elections. The federal government does not count one vote, does not administer one system, does not run or register one voter, right? What we do is bring expertise to the state and local election officials in regard to securing their systems, cybersecurity. And so what that empowered us to do is starting in 2017, and the pushback from the states, I think, was both healthy and appropriate. It was them saying, and the localities, them saying, we run elections, not you. You need to outline for us what this means, because this is our bailiwick, not yours, and that's important, right? And in fact, in Georgia, They accused the Department of Homeland Security of attempting to hack their systems at one point. That's how negative the relationship was. And we, explained what was going on. That was not true, but that the relationship was incredibly toxic. So it was up to us at the federal level to show state and local election officials that we recognize their expertise in running elections and that it's our job to bring value to them by sharing threat information, by helping to better secure their systems, and by going out into the field with them to understand how elections were run and understanding where the risks lie and help them mitigate those risks. But they administer all of the elections. So now, leading into 2020, what did we have? And this is why CISA, in coordination with the Government Coordinating Council, which is state and local election officials, and Sector Coordinating Council, which is the private sector, put out a statement saying most secure election in American history. That wasn't just some, we'll throw that at the wall and see if anyone agrees. That was a factual statement based on our understanding of the systems and the actions that state and local election officials had taken. More paper ballots than ever before, more audits than ever before. We had intrusion detection sensors deployed out into the state election networks, looking for malicious activity, reporting back to the state, reporting back to us, so we could see, okay, is there targeting of these systems? If yes, what does it look like? How do we mitigate it? In real time, right? Responding to that. We had information sharing across thousands of jurisdictions where state and locals were reporting in information saying, hey, we're seeing this. What do you guys know about that? How can you help us, right? So we're responding to that. You had more multi-factor authentication. You had more log review and auditing. You had more cybersecurity exercises, right? Red teaming exercises between state, local, and federal government saying what could go wrong, how do we identify it, how do we respond? All of these things are in place in the lead up to the 2020 election so that I'm sitting in Arlington, Virginia on election day, connected virtually with thousands of local jurisdictions, and it's quiet. Right?
Like Natalie
it's
said.
quiet. Yes, it's quiet. This was the quietest presidential election I've ever experienced. And we were prepared for nation state interference. We were prepared for possible domestic interference and otherwise, right? And it didn't happen. It didn't play. And we were connected. We were watching. We were looking. We were talking to those state and local election officials constantly, right? And so that's why when we come out and say the most secure election, one, it doesn't mean we're not going to have a more secure election in 2022 or 20. There's areas for improvement. But we had a level of confidence in the work that the state and local election officials had done because we had been out in the field with them, working with them, right? So I appreciate that question because you cannot understand how seriously state and local election officials took the threat from 2016 and responded and invested their time and energy and resources into ensuring that they had the proper both cybersecurity practices, but then response activity and mitigation plans. Nothing was going to allow that election to be interrupted that they couldn't respond to. And then a pandemic hits, right? And they respond to that and identify risks there and mitigate those. So it was an incredible effort by the state and local election officials that gave us a level of confidence in what happened in 2020.
Al, as you well know, there are a lot of isms in the American vernacular. We don't need any more, but I'm going to invent one. Urbanism, which is sort of a part of this election skepticism. Like, urban America is where all this bad stuff happens. Cities, Philly, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Detroit. And there is, let us be candid, a history of muscular urban voting patterns in our history. That is sort of the backdrop in which these allegations have some sort of resonance. Explain, because I'm sure you talk to all these officials, what you do, how you've adapted, what changes you've made, and how you try to counteract what this sort of stereotypical allegation that hangs over big American cities and the way they vote.
I had the opportunity to talk a little with Ben Ginsberg before coming up here, and I mentioned that even though I live in Philadelphia, I was originally from Pittsburgh, and that the only bigotry my parents raised me with was that Philadelphia was the worst place in the world, not just the sports teams, but all of it, and that it was a place where bad things happen. So the moment where I'm watching the debate and you hear President Trump say, bad things happen in Philadelphia, you understood immediately what he was sort of tapping into. He didn't have to convince people that bad things happen in Philadelphia. There's already a perception that bad things happen in the cities. There's other common denominators other than being big cities, and that is cities that were repeatedly named. I mean, Boston's a pretty decent-sized city, more Democratic to Republican than Philadelphia. No one talks about voter fraud going on in Boston or anything like that. So, you know, I think there's a, you know, if you asked the registered voters, regular voters, if you asked Americans the same question that you just asked us, is it possible for an election to be stolen? A significant number, certainly a majority of my party, would say yes, because, for example, it just was. And one interesting phenomenon that we're seeing in Pennsylvania, not in big cities, but in more rural counties, is the voter fraud that's occurred by mail that we have identified, that has been identified and prosecuted, has been almost exclusively, if not exclusively, done by Republican voters. And my guess is that it's not obviously that Republicans are more inclined to commit voter fraud than Democrats, or Democrats and Republicans, or anything like that. But clearly they're believing that it's easy to commit voter fraud. They don't know that there are safeguards built in the front end of the system, throughout the system, and in the back end of the system to detect it and identify it and refer it to law enforcement. Just very quickly, when I got elected in 2011, re-elected in 2015, and re-elected in 19, it was with support from Republicans and progressive Democrats. And one of the main items was to investigate and do something about voter fraud.
Yep.
Took it head on, made referrals.
And enemies.
And it does occur. It occurs infrequently, and it's easy to detect. And those cases were identified and prosecuted. And that shouldn't make you think that it's so vulnerable. It should give you confidence that people are being prosecuted for it when it does occur, because it is infrequent, it is easy to detect. But it's one reason why I think being so hawkish about voter fraud in the past put me in a position of feeling very comfortable talking about the fact that it was not going on in the 2020 election.
And Natalie, you wanted to give a detailed answer. I'm going to invite you to give another detailed answer because, if you wish.
I'll try.
Because I think one of the misperceptions people have who have questions about elections, election is on a certain day or there's a couple of weeks ahead, and they think that's the time where all the activity is. I've come to realize it's a continuous process, and at the local level, you are working on elections 18 months out and then 6 months after. Then you start preparing for the next election. And one of the reasons, or one of the ways to evaluate this idea, well, can an American election be stolen? Explain from your vantage point and what you do, how you prepare, and the time it takes to prepare, and what goes into that preparation process to make sure it can't be.
Sure. Like you said, it starts very far ahead in advance, and people often ask me, well, what do you do when elections aren't happening? And I'm like, nothing. No, I'm kidding. What we do, first of all, because we are all vote by mail in my county and throughout the state, but we also offer in-person options. We start looking for locations and make sure that those are secure. The locations have to be ADA accessible. They have to be in a place where it is just sort of accessible to people generally. So my county is under a set of administrative rules under the Voters' Choice Act of California. And within the Voters' Choice Act, there are, I think, 14 or 15 different guidelines for how you should cite a voting location, how you should cite a drop box location. So we sort of go through and make sure that it is, in fact, close to transportation, accessible to people who sort of fall under certain protected categories, sort of stuff of that nature. For example, if we wanted to locate a vote center in a school, we would have to reach out to that school about 18 months in advance because, they have sporting events, they have, sort of other things going on. A lot of our venues are very big. Sometimes people, have their parties and their weddings, so we want to be able to lock down those dates pretty far in advance. In-person voting begins 10 days before the election for most people, unless they have access to our headquarters. Our headquarters actually allows early voting 29 days before the election. So there is a lot to sort of consider and coordinate. Another consideration that has come up very recently is the nationwide paper shortage. So I've already got to, I think we're actually locking down our order for the November election envelopes now. And we haven't even had the June primary yet. Our ballot vendor is asking us about paper and ballots for the November election, and we're like, can we please get through the June primary first before we put in our order? But that is how serious it is. Candidate filing in our state occurs several months in advance of the election, so we've got to sort of educate the candidates on what they need to do and what processes they need to go through, how much it costs for them to file. So I think just the sort of very basics of ordering supplies, establishing where things are going to take place, and preparing our candidates. That's like the first tranche of things. Throughout, we do voter list maintenance. Then we have to start thinking about, okay, well, when does the Secretary of State want something called a report of registration? California is a bottom-up state, so we have to do something called synchronization of the local database through the Secretary of State's statewide voter registration database. That involves a lot of steps on cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be able to do this, sort of pretty securely, and once we sort of get up to the close of registration, we then have same-day registration. It requires us to have our vote center set up where we give registration and voting history updates in real time to the statewide database. That requires a secure connection. We work very closely with our IT department on that. This is only a very small chunk of things. We are also in that whole process recruiting our in-person election workers. We're re-onboarding our county staff who all go through criminal background checks to ensure the sort of safety and integrity of each election. We're building our communications with our voters, letting them know, okay, yes, there is an election coming up. Yes, you will have a statewide and a countywide voter information guide. We build all of that. We build the ballots. What else do you want? We, have to.
We haven't even gotten to election day. yet.
I know,
day.
right?
And this is why I asked, and I invite Al and Matt to jump in on this, because this is the granular, and I've learned a lot about this in the last 2 or 3 years. As many of you know, I covered presidential campaigns for most of my career in Washington, covered presidencies in Congress, and I won't say I took this process for granted, but I more or less glossed over it because we hadn't had the sense of tumult that we have seen in the last 18 months. And that tumult has led me to dive much more deeply into the granular nature of how we do this. And it is a step-by-step process. And I will go anywhere in this country and talk to any audience from now until I'm done on this topic, to help people understand, because there's this idea that there's a ghost in the machine, that there's just this vast machinery and there's a ghost in it and we can't decipher it. It's undecipherable. No, it's decipherable, I promise you. A dummy like me can decipher it. This granular preparation is essential to the step-by-step process of having an election that can meet the test of our time, which is secure, verifiable, scrutinized, and legitimate. And then we move on and we deal with what the voters decided. The elections are just a point in which to gather everyone's opinion, and then we move on to the next thing. Al, all these things obviously resonated with you, this preparation process.
Yes, and I wrote down something that David Becker said earlier, which was the 2020 election was, I think, the greatest achievement in our American democracy as far as elections go. And you would think that because it was the most safe and secure, that people would have more confidence. Perversely, they have less, but it might be because of the improvements that we've made, if that makes any sense. Live cams in our on our floor to make sure that our clerks and our ballots are constantly visible, not just through live cam, but people can sit at home in their pajamas and watch it 24 hours a day because we're working 24 hours a day.
Nearly as good as Bridgerton. Nearly as good.
And all of the other, and Pennsylvania with a new, not just a new voting system in person, but a new system of voting with voting by mail. So much of this is new. People with normal lives and plenty to do don't understand that sort of granularity of how it all happens. It seems very, very new, very difficult to comprehend and all the rest. And perversely, I think a lot of the improvements that we've made to make elections more secure and more transparent and everything else is one of the things that progress in some way has led people to have less confidence because, what are they doing over there? Did they just pull a box of ballots out from underneath that table?
Right.
I saw it on the live cam.
Right.
And things like that. It doesn't give people more confidence.
Is there more in a affirmative way that election officials should think about, more work they should think about doing to communicate this in-between process?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, and I think Natalie spoke to this a little bit, is when you have people with this mindset, it might not be best to say buzz off. It might best be to say become more engaged. Take training to be an election board worker. If you take training to be an election board worker, you're going to understand the whole process from beginning to end. It's going to become demystified, and the solution might be more engagement, not less. At the same time, it is so incredibly important, and we're seeing it throughout the country, not just with secretaries of state being elected, but governors, like in Pennsylvania, being elected, where they will appoint the secretary of state to run elections, that people not be responsible for running elections whose goal it is to undermine confidence in the elections that they themselves ran. And I think that's one of the biggest dangers we're seeing right now.
Well, and can I make
Sure.
just to add a point with
Please.
the communications thing? I'd like to think I'm kind of articulate, and I could talk until I'm blue in the face to this voter to that voter about what it is that we do. I can invite them to become an election worker, and I am not a communications professional. I'm just one person in some county where people are like, Nevada County, is that in the state of Nevada? They don't know where I am or what I do. It'd be really helpful to have sort of allies who maybe are a little bit more visible in the world, who are saying the same things that Al is saying, that Matt is saying about how our elections are secure. I would like to see some more members of Congress who are sort of allies of ours, who are on our side, more organizations like the Carter Center, like the Baker Institute, really sort of taking this home. People have a tendency to listen to political elites, and I mean, I'm just one person in one county. I mean, right? So I think that the more that we can ingrain this messaging into the political discussion and even in our pop culture would be extremely helpful, because we can't do it on our own.
No doubt. We've got about 41 minutes to go. I'm going to open the floor up for questions after I talk to Matt here for just 1 second. So the questions, that mill has begun to churn, not 25, but probably at 35 or 33 or 39, depending on how long Matt is. Matt, one of the elements that happened post-2020 was states went to court and said, our system was great, but that state's system was constitutionally suspect. And I'm going to challenge on behalf of my voters the constitutional efficacy of another state because they denied my voters their constitutionally protected rights. Now, maybe we've seen that before. I'd never run across that particular judicial angle taken. But it has then created a sub-atmosphere, it seems to me, where people will say, well, Nevada County is great. It's Wisconsin that's screwed up. It's Pennsylvania that's screwed up. So I have confidence in my local elections, but I don't believe the national elections. Matt, talk about this, because at CISA, this was one of the areas of, I would think, pretty regular concern.
Yeah, absolutely. So as much as the decentralized nature is a strength, as we talked about before, one of the challenges is exactly what you just described, that the procedures, the systems vary so wildly state to state, county to county, township to township in some cases, and it causes confusion, right? Well, my mom told me, she did it this way, but that isn't the way I did it here, right? And it leads to a lot of questions. And so in the sort of perfect example of that comes from the Sharpie Gate incident that kind of came out of Maricopa County in 2020, where the accusation was that Maricopa County was intentionally using Sharpies to cause bleed through on Republican ballots to invalidate those ballots. That's the core of the allegation. It's completely false. Sharpies were actually the recommended writing implement by the vendor for that system, and no ballots were invalidated. But what ended up happening is not only did Maricopa County have to respond to this, but counties across the country that don't use that voting system, that don't use Sharpies at all, are now having to respond to this because of the inconsistency across state and local jurisdictions. So what do we do about it? How did we think about this? One is, at CISA, we spent a ton of time, and you hear it in Natalie and Al's answers, red teaming out. What are the systems? What are the processes? What are the procedures? How are they changing due to COVID? Where could this cause problems? How do we work with the state and local officials? How are they thinking about it? And then doing tabletop exercises in those states about this to say, okay, if this happens, how would you respond? And I'll be honest, I mean this with all the love in my heart. Tabletop exercising with election officials is hell, because they want to change the scenarios because we never get the details right, and all they want to talk about is the details. And you're like, no, don't worry about that. And they're like, well, that's all I worry about, so that's what we're talking about. Because the best election officials are control freaks. Like, they control every aspect of everything, right? And so as we talk about and think about the processes and procedures, we have to take, and this goes to the communication challenge, we have to take it up another level. It's not about the system Natalie uses or the procedures that Al has necessarily. It's the fact that, one, across all the states, the process is transparent. There are transparency laws on the books in all 50 states and the 5 territories about how elections are run so that people can watch the action. 2, it's bipartisan or multipartisan. All 50 states and the 5 territories have partisan involvement in the process, recognizing that we need to watch it. The players of the game need to be able to participate directly by watching each step of the process. And 3, it's administered by professionals. As Natalie said, she doesn't just wake up one Tuesday and decide, hey, I think I'm going to run some elections. This sounds like a good time, right? She spends all her time, 365 days a year, thinking, what could go wrong? How do I mitigate it? What else could go wrong? And so that's true across the board. And so why that's important is when election officials in Ohio are invariably asked about Michigan, and we love Michigan and Ohio, right? When we're invariably asked about Michigan, I don't have to get into the details of how they run elections in Michigan. What I know and can tell my voters is I don't know exactly what their laws are. They're not the same as here in Ohio, but I know their process is transparent. I know their process is bipartisan or multipartisan. And I know I've been in training programs, certification programs with the professionals that run elections up there, and I know they do a damn good job, right? And so that, I think, and there's probably other pillars to this, but that's true across all 50 states, and I think helps manage the differences. And I think the differences are important because what Natalie's county needs isn't the same as what Philadelphia needs. So we need that flexibility for election officials, but it is hard to explain, right? It's hard to explain to voters why it's so different one state to the other, one county sometimes to the other.
Al, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
I just wanted to say that even though we have all these different counties and states doing things and references to other states doing them differently, we do have a federal court system. And when all of this sort of political propaganda hit the federal court system, it was completely shut down. mainly, at least in our case in Pennsylvania, by either Republican judges or Republican judges appointed by former President Trump. So the federal system, you have this argument about, did the thing hold together because of a few dozen people in really critical spots, or because the institutions really held? That institution really held, and that transcends the states.
All right, I'm going to go through these questions as I have them, but the first one is not a question necessarily, but I think it's a compliment, Natalie. Who is going to make the Netflix documentary following the election processes from the point of view of Natalie in 2024?
Yes.
So all you in the Netflix developmental beehive, take note, all right? Can a foreign power or actor really meddle with U.S. presidential elections? Matt, I think that's right in your wheelhouse.
So can a foreign, again, this goes back, meddle, yes, we saw it in 2016, right?
Define meddle.
So yeah, so in the case of 2016, we saw a nation state, in this case Russia, target actual election infrastructure, right? They targeted voter registration data and databases, and in a couple of cases actually took data from those systems. We then saw them pursue a mis and disinformation campaign to undermine confidence in our democratic institutions, including the elections process. So combining, both hacking activities with mis and disinformation, and then of course there's the hack and leak involving the DNC and involvement there. So that's a pretty textbook case of meddling in our election process. Obviously, it was the first time we had seen that kind of activity. And then in 2020, not to be ignored, the Iranians decided to get involved, right? So 2020, the Iranians got voter registration data, sometimes just because it's available. You can purchase it or obtain it for free from some states, and targeted voters with messages purporting to be from the Proud Boys saying, hey, we know how you're going to vote. If you vote that way, there are consequences, right? So trying to discourage voters, trying to make the process seem flawed or rigged in order to undermine confidence. The difference 2016 to 2020 is we at the federal level had this relationship with thousands of state and local election officials that when these emails started hitting voters' inboxes, they immediately start reporting it to us. Hey, this is a thing that's happening. We're able to then work with the intelligence community, the FBI, and the local election officials. And within 27 hours of the first reports, we're briefing the election officials, and there's a national press conference to say, we're attributing this to the Iranian government. Here's what they did. No impact on the election or processes. No voters will be disenfranchised. You can have confidence. And that's the level of improvement that took place 2016 to 2020. So can they meddle? Yes. Are we much better prepared than we were in 2016? And will we continue to be better prepared? Absolutely, yes.
I'm going to give this to Al and Natalie. This is a long question, but I think it's a good one. There are a number of election deniers running for Secretary of State across the country. Are you concerned that these candidates will use their offices to influence the results of future elections? Do we have mechanisms in place to prevent elections from being stolen under the pretext of fixing non-existent voter fraud?
So is the question, are we concerned?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Should I say more?
Please.
Well, absolutely. And I wouldn't confine the concern just to the Secretary of State, but also at the local level. I think there are a number of people in my state who are looking at the clerk recorder position, or whatever you call it in the counties. It sort of varies with the county. Sometimes it's the auditor clerk, or in my case, it's the clerk recorder. I am running to replace my boss in this election. He, after a long career in public service, wants to retire, and he deserves to do that. And my not one but two competitors are each sort of in the camp of, well, there was a lot of fraud, and we should question the results of the 2020 and the 2016 elections in Nevada County. And they are sort of targeting me in particular because of sort of an unfortunate incident with one of our citizens that resulted in a restraining order. So, I think that, just with sort of the state level offices, and we do have somebody in our state who I think is very well funded and is also, sort of in this election denier camp. for one thing, I can't imagine what how that would change the dynamic of the relationship between the counties and the state. We do meet every month with the Secretary of State's office over the phone or virtually to get updates and to talk about, changes in law, changes in process. I don't want to imagine what kind of crazy bananas things I would hear if the process was run by somebody coming in with a presumption that everything is fraudulent, right? At the local level, I think I can safely say my staff, who are, in some cases have been serving for years and years, they're quite afraid that I might lose my election, and it is because they know that my competitors have zero experience in government, they have zero experience in elections, and not to mention the sort of clerk and recorder function of my office as well. So they are pretty on edge as to what the result is going to be. And I tell them, you know what? At a certain point, it's going to be up for Nevada County voters to decide. So if you're worried, tell your friends to vote for me.
Right. But you're living what this question is about. Al, any thoughts?
No, I mean, it is concerning. It's particularly concerning right now because even though 2020 was some time ago, 2022 is, I think, where we're going to first see the actual consequences of what occurred in the 2020 election, because it wasn't a federal election last year. And other than, I think, New Jersey and Virginia, there weren't state elections. So none of this was really kind of on the ballot indirectly through who the candidates are sort of getting elected. And who gets elected in 2022 is going to be running elections in 2024, the main event on the horizon here.
This next question merges your world and my world, the media's world. Should something be done with the timing of election results reporting on election night and the following days? Can early reporting give the public the impression results are being manipulated? Matt, you sounded like you wanted to jump in on that.
This is a great question, and I have a very unpopular answer to this, which is not surprising, I guess. But
I'm glad we're having this conversation privately.
Yes, yeah, no, that's good. Let me just, if I may,
Between
riff
you
for
and
a
me.
while. From an election official standpoint, unofficial results that are published on election night afterwards serve no purpose in advancing the process, right? Their goal is to get to certified election results, right? To go through the canvassing process, to go through the reviews, the checks, the balances that exist to get to a certified result. The existence of election night reporting is to serve the candidates, to serve the media, to serve the people. There's a transparency element that I think is important, but it doesn't do anything to advance the administration of elections and of the actual certification of the election result. They're still going to do all of those things that they have to do, regardless of who the media calls on election night, right? They're still going to count provisional votes and balance the books and all that. So to me, it's not an option not to have some sort of information or results on election night. The question is, what should the local election official and even state election officials' role be in that versus the media and how they use and track that information? I think there is an argument to be made that state and local election officials shouldn't put up unofficial results, but instead have a transparent process to share with the media where the media can go through their process, because it doesn't advance the administration of the actual election. Now, the reason I think that won't happen is because that's the day that the most attention and hits are applied, particularly to Secretary of State's websites. And so that's a really good day for them as public officials, with people visiting their websites and getting the information that they need. But election night results, they set an expectation that isn't actually what's happening in the process at that time. And that I think is a problem.
Al, you lived this minute by minute in the 2020 election. Did you not?
Yes, and it was an example of our worlds colliding.
Yes.
Because leading up to the election, talking to so many journalists, both TV and print and digital and all the rest, and them doing such a great job saying, listen, the results are going to take a while. Half of the voters in Philadelphia, for example, voted by mail. We can't even begin processing those mail-in ballots. Not even just counting, but
Help
even
the audience
processing.
understand what that means, process.
We have to review the sufficiency of the outer declaration envelope. We then have to, and this is done in a big assembly line in batches. So this isn't like one ballot moving through. It's batches of, first we review the sufficiency of the declaration envelope, then we extract the secrecy envelope from the declaration envelope, then we extract the ballot from the secrecy envelope, and then we flatten the ballot so it can go through the digital scanner for the calculation, and then it's scanned. And all this, by the way, is taking place directly in public view. But it takes a while because our voting by mail system is new, but our system for processing mail-in ballots, unlike some other states like Florida who do it really well, and I think causes a lot of whiplash for voters, is Florida already posted their results at around midnight. Philadelphia had like barely started. It's because, and you could see it in all the court cases, suggestions Philadelphia is holding back on the results. They want to see what the results were from in-person voting so they can manufacture enough ballots to dump them in later on to shift it in the other direction. But in talking to journalists, doing such a good job in lead up to the election, saying, listen, this is going to take a while in Pennsylvania. And then 8:01 on election night, talking to those same people on TV, saying, so do you have the results yet? Who won? Like it was like that. And is it done yet? Is it done yet? Is it done yet? It's like my kids in the back seat asking if we're there yet, or we're there yet, or we're there yet. It's like, no, I told you it's going to be 2 hours.
And or several days.
Or several days.
As it turned out in Pennsylvania. And if I remember correctly, many of the networks on that Saturday morning, mine included, were waiting for the tranches of ballots to come through in your county and Allegheny County, correct?
Yes, and we were counting 24 hours a day, and viewable both from observers and on TV.
So next question. This is to the panel. So raise your hand if you want to jump in on this. You've established that elections cannot be stolen at the state and local level. How about at the certification in the U.S. Congress?
So that's why I hedged my question or with a caveat in the beginning, is I think one of the most revealing things that the January 6th commission or committee has done is kind of reveal those communications where there are very important and significant people having conversations about selecting a candidate other than the one that the voters selected through different mechanisms and through different legal strategies and through all the rest, having communications about like really wild stuff like foreign interference. Congressman Scott Perry in Pennsylvania is talking about the Brits hacked our system and they're working with Italy, and just suggesting that the director of national intelligence investigate all of this because someone told him. Like really significant, that's the most chilling thing, is really significant people having that conversation at that level and at that time saying there's only so many days left for us to do this.
Mm-hmm. Matt?
I think it's why the conversation around the sort of wonky reforms to the Electoral College Vote Act, right, are really important, and I hope move forward, because that's not an insignificant risk. In the end, people in positions that mattered, including secretaries of state, local election officials, others stood up and advanced democracy in the process, but we should recognize that there's a risk there, and at the very least, take a look at a law that is both antiquated and not very well written and see if improvements can't be made. So I hope that continues to be furthered.
Next question. In the 21st century, is it viable to move to secure, verifiable online voting?
I think the operative words there are secure and verifiable.
Yep.
I think that there's a lot of figuring out to do if we are going to stop using paper verified system and go completely electronic. I think just the shift in thinking and the shift in the way we administer elections has got to be pretty drastic in order for that to happen.
Matt?
Just in 2020, DHS, NIST, the EAC, and the FBI put out information to election officials that was a risk assessment for online voting. And the reality is, even with appropriate or attempted mitigations, it's a high-risk activity. Not only is it a high-risk activity, but it's virtually impossible at this point to offer that level of verification and auditability. And the question I would have is, why would an election official who's being scrutinized at the level, threatened at the level that they're being threatened, opt to move to a system that makes it harder to offer transparency and evidence in this current environment? Why would you do that right now? Now, it's an appropriate question, but given what we just went through, why would you take that on as an election official when your goal right now is to offer as much evidence and as much transparency as you can? And that fundamentally just cannot exist with an online system like that.
Al, I want to ask this one to you, because I like the spirit of this question. Was 2016 the second most secure, accurate, and verifiable election?
In American history, that's a heck of a...
And I think the spirit of it is, what was 2016? President Trump won. Hello, come on. It was close. There were questions. He won.
And I can say in Philadelphia, we did not have in 2016 what we had in 2020, which were voter verifiable, printed ink on paper names of candidates, ballots that are cast. We had a totally different system that was largely electronic, not on paper.
And part of I think the spirit of this question is, that maybe those of us who have said this are sort of shoving this idea down people's throat that 2020 was so great. And I think from my perspective, and I'll ask the panel this as well, it's just that there was so many difficult things about the 2020 election, obstacles that had not occurred before. The turnout was 20 million more. That is a sizable quantum leap in turnout. We had a huge turnout after the 2000 election in 2004. Roughly about 15.5 million more voters showed up. We had another 5 million in 2020 on top of that. So difficult circumstances, lots of different changes, lots of different voter education, huge turnout, and the system not only held, but performed better than you thought of day of, you were afraid of day of. And so I think that's sort of why that this 2020 election gets this description, not only is because it's been unfairly maligned and slandered, but because it really did work, and it stands in contrast to a comparatively lower turnout 2016 election.
Yeah, I think there's two important points there, and you made the direct statement, which is really important, that 2016, to be clear, despite Russian interference, there's absolutely no evidence of manipulation of voter information or the changing of votes or targeting of voting systems, right? So let's be very clear about that the election officials administered an accurate, secure election in 2016. But the improvements, at least in my experience, around specifically cybersecurity and the securing of the systems, including 95% of votes cast in 2020 having that auditable paper record versus approximately 86% of votes cast in 2016, differentiate 2016 from 2020 in that way. As a direct result of the activity we saw in 2016, it is a credit to the election officials that looked at that and said, a nation state targeted us. It targeted us in the process we administer. What do we need to do to further secure this process? And then they went about doing it. And that to be very clear, 2016, as the Senate Intelligence Committee report directly notes, there's no evidence that any votes were changed or voting systems impacted. But then the improvements made from 2016 to 2020 were substantial.
Next question. What do you say to people who worry about the privacy of their vote? I hear and talk to voters who are convinced workers know how they voted and are intimidated by that.
So the people who think that we're looking at their votes are intimidated by that. Yeah, I mean, no. I can say with complete confidence that me, my staff, we care about the process of tabulation. We care about the process of elections. We do not care how you voted. This really came up in sort of unhealthy way in the 2021 gubernatorial recall. There was a thing trending on the Twitter with a young lady who had her ballot from, I think it was Los Angeles County, and she's showing people how she's voting in the recall, and then she's complaining about these holes in the return envelope. The holes are they serve a couple of functions. One, quality assurance to make sure that we have extracted all of the ballots from their envelopes. But also there are these small holes that help guide voters with sight disabilities as to where they need to sort of apply their signature on a vote by mail ballot. This person insisted, and it sort of went viral, and all kinds of voters had called my office saying, oh well, the post office is going to be able to see how I voted on the recall and which of the replacement candidates I voted for, so they're going to choose which ballots to deliver, which ones not to deliver, or if it gets there because I use a drop box, the election officials are going to start looking really closely at whether I voted yes or no on the recall question. And it was just a really ridiculous piece of misinformation. And I say it's ridiculous, from my perspective, because none of us are looking. It never even occurred to my staff that we would, use the holes in that way. One. And two, we told people, look, if you're worried about your vote being revealed, take that ballot and fold it the other way, so none of your vote choices are showing, or vote in person if you want to. There are a lot of options there, but I share that story because I think that there is a belief that we're tracking it somehow. People will call us, absent the story about holes in envelopes, and say, well, you have in your records on how I voted. And we say, well, no, we don't. We give you credit for having participated, that you cast the ballot.
That you voted.
Yeah, that you
how
voted,
you
but
voted.
I don't know how you voted in the last presidential election or any other contest. So I think it's important for us to keep reminding people, we give you credit for voting, but your ballot is anonymous. And there are good public policy reasons for having a secret ballot, and in fact, in California, you have the right to cast a secret ballot. That is in our California Voter Bill of Rights.
There you go. Al, this is something that I think you might want to weigh in on. Absentee ballots or mail-in ballots are the only ballots voted outside of the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. There are some who feel this could be a source of fraud. How can it be better communicated that there is integrity in voting by mail?
So
You dealt with this.
Yeah, and it's an excellent question. It is done just as secretly as a voter casting their vote in a booth with a curtain drawn. The vulnerability would not be in the application side of it, because you have to supply in Pennsylvania your driver's license number or social security number in order to receive a ballot to begin with. They're not just sent out in mass. That vulnerability, I suppose, would have to be some sort of voter intimidation where someone is, forcing someone to fill out a ballot in a certain way, or stealing that ballot and then returning it, although then we would, the voter who requested it would not have received the ballot and would cast a vote on the voting machine on election day or contact our office. But it's a very good question. It's not so much, I would think, voter fraud as it is a potential for voter intimidation, where someone else is coercing someone to fill out a ballot a certain way.
And this indirectly leads, and I will jump in for a question here because it's come up in the conversation, the ever-evolving conversation, I should note, about how the election might have been stolen. It evolves in many, many iterations. We're on about the 15th or 16th iteration right now, if I've kept track. And Matt and Al and Natalie, one of those is harvesting of mail-in ballots. This has become slightly topical here in Georgia a couple of months ago. The Secretary of State is looking into it, but it's become a broader thing in the larger conversation. Al and Natalie, describe what that in theory means, and what are the guardrails or safeguards against it?
Well, I mean, I will say that our state legislature had passed a law that allows for something like ballot harvesting. So what people are referring to, for those of you who don't know, ballot harvesting is, I guess the practice of collecting other people's vote by mails and hopefully bringing it to my office. But under the law that you are supposed to, as a voter, deliver your own ballot. Either if it's vote by mail by U.S. mail or by dropping it in a drop box. We have on our envelope a space for the voter to verify, yes, I did willingly hand over my ballot to somebody. Here's who I handed it to, and here's my signature saying that I allowed this whole process to happen.
Essentially an attestation.
Right.
That this was done voluntarily and with their acknowledgement.
Right. And I think that there are people who are very worried about this, and I say, well, would you give your ballot to somebody you don't know? You don't have to do that, and if you are concerned, we can pick up your ballot for you. We'll always do it in a team of 2. And we will make sure that your ballot gets over to our office. If you have a specific concern, you don't want to use a drop box, you don't want to use the U.S. mail, and you can't show up in person for some reason. But what I tell people is, don't ever give your ballot to somebody that you don't know. It is okay for a family member to deliver your ballot on your behalf. And honestly, the only problem that I have heard of, specifically with anything that resembled ballot harvesting in recent years. We had a situation in some of California counties where there were these unofficial drop boxes that were established, I think in Los Angeles, Orange, and a few other of the big counties. They were established by members of a certain party, and I just sort of found it interesting that on the one hand there's this complaints about ballot harvesting, and on the other hand you're setting up unofficial drop boxes and encouraging people to use them.
Meaning those aren't going to be collected and counted.
Well, I think that we have a tool called ballot tracks in California where, we have a roster of everyone who was sent a vote by mail, and voters can opt in to ballot tracks if they're concerned about whether their ballot got sent over and received by our office. They can check ballot tracks, they can call us, and we'll make sure that if you did not get your ballot or if your ballot was not received, that you will still be able to vote.
Al?
In Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, with only a few exceptions, voters must return their own ballot, whether they're dropping it in the mailbox or dropping it in a drop box. There's an exception that involves some paperwork that would allow a voter a person to carry another person's ballot under very specific circumstances. So much of it, though, is curiously tied to combating drop boxes. I'm talking about legitimate drop boxes, and a suggestion that ballot harvesting, people are harvesting these ballots or collecting these ballots and dropping them into drop boxes. Our drop boxes in Pennsylvania are not only secure and secured, but they have video surveillance 24 hours a day and all the rest. And if somebody were going to do it, it would make much more sense to put it in the mailbox, conceivably, with thousands of those in Philadelphia, than our dozen or 2 dozen drop boxes under the conditions that they exist. But it's interesting how ballot harvesting is being used as leverage to try to get rid of or minimize the use of or availability of drop boxes.
Next question. Can the panel suggest any changes to current election administration that could engender more trust?
Sure. So getting to, essentially 100% use of paper ballots or voter verifiable paper records, and then having post-election audits within the certification timeline, such that if something were discovered wrong, you could correct that issue, or two. A third, in my opinion, would be consistent and steady funding of state and local election offices so that they can invest in the types of systems, processes, and people that allow them to then offer evidence to their voters about the security, integrity, and accuracy of the election. Right now, I mean, the reality is that there's a paradigm shift that the election officials did not ask for from 2020. It used to be election officials would say, our job is to convince the loser that they lost, right? Okay. The paradigm shift now is election officials have to assume that the loser will not accept that they lost and offer enough information, evidence, and communicate with their voters enough that they can have confidence in the process even if the loser doesn't accept that they lost. And that's going to take additional resources that currently aren't being dedicated to state and local election officials.
Any other thoughts? Al?
I would just say very quickly, because voting by mail is new to Pennsylvania, like I mentioned about processing mail-in ballots before, in the lead up to Election Day, as opposed to having the whole process start at 7 a.m. on Election Day, would allow us to report results faster and minimize the window for people to attempt to delegitimize the process, because you would have the results a lot earlier. One good thing that we have in Pennsylvania right now, it's also a bad thing, is really divided government. We have a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic governor. So none of the things that have occurred that have limited access to voting that we've seen in some other states has happened, but nor have some of these important improvements that will go a long way to building confidence in the results.
Natalie?
I think that further. I mean, the field is already very professionalized, but further professionalization of our jobs and the ability to actually have enough funding to spend on what we need to spend would be really helpful. I would like to see sort of more permanent staff in my office. In my office, there are 5 people who really focus on elections, including me. And I mean, that's to serve 75,000 registered voters. So, I would like to see, for example, a sort of a professional communications person who can help me, sort of address some of the mis and disinformation about elections. I would like to have, more drop boxes that are, sort of securely anchored into the ground. Right now, I have 2 of them, and they're open 24/7. The rest of them are in our local businesses, mostly grocery stores. They're monitored by people, and I would like to see more people use them. About 50% of our voters use them who return a valid ballot. So I think just having more robust staff to communicate what it is that we're doing and making voting more convenient gives people a lot of confidence.
Natalie, you intuitively captured one of the questions that I didn't get a chance to ask, which was, should those in your line of work have someone within their orbit, a communication specialist, to help tell this story, to help engage while you're doing this granular work we talked about before? Have someone on your behalf and on behalf of your hardworking staff, or you, Al, or anyone in this line of work, do some outreach.
Oh yeah, definitely. I have a tendency to get real deep into the weeds and very detailed about how I communicate with voters. I need someone who can just cut through all of that and be like, okay, here are the 2 or 3 points that you need to make to people. And I mean, it requires a lot of training and a lot of experience that, frankly, I don't have on the communication side.
All right, we are near the end. We've got about 2 minutes left. Final words, we'll go, Matt, in this direction.
Final words are that 2 things. One is that the incentive structure is broken right now, and I think we have to recognize that. Right now, the incentive structure is built such that those pushing forward with the lies, the misinformation, disinformation, the grift around this election are incentivized because they're raising massive amounts of money and their own political fortunes around this lie. It is a constant, and there are virtually no consequences. And so as we've talked about all the things that Natalie and Al and the election community need to do to continue to build confidence, to talk to voters, all very important. One of the missing components of this is accountability for those that have pushed these lies, that have profited off of this grift. And if that doesn't come about, I'm worried that the incentive structure will continue to be perverted such that more people will have to pursue that because that's what the incentives say, and our democracy will continue to be undermined. With that said, I have incredible confidence and trust in the election officials across this country of both parties to administer safe, secure, accurate elections on an ongoing basis in the face of these lies, in the face of this grift. And anything we can do to continue to amplify their voices, as you've been doing, thank you, as others like the Carter Center are doing, is so critically important because voters need to hear directly from them as the trusted voices on these issues.
Al?
I think it's ultimately that election administrators across the country really need help. They're very focused on their job, which is running elections, making sure they're safe and secure, and all the minutia and all the mechanisms that make sure that's the case. But they're on the receiving end of an avalanche of lies that frequently result in violent threats and death threats to themselves and their family and all the rest, and that we should both protect our human infrastructure the same way we protect our physical infrastructure and our cybersecurity infrastructure. The people who are running elections are in a very vulnerable position. Most of them don't have the time or the inclination to deal with a lot of these things because that avalanche hits at the moment when you're the most busy sort of doing your job. You mentioned communications. I was very fortunate to have a communications director working on my team that could monitor social media and report in real time and what the arguments should be to counter it when it was coming up from the president or any others. But election administrators need help, particularly when it comes to communications.
Natalie?
I think we run good elections in this country, and if my office is any example, it's full of people who are part of your community and who care very much about the elections being fair and having a process that people are invited into. We're expected to know a lot. We're expected to do a lot. And, frankly, the job is made harder when, you are sort of sitting there wondering whether or not somebody is going to threaten you, harass you, hurt you. You don't know if they're serious. You don't know if they're just mad. There was a point in time when I would be working and need to go across the hall to use the restroom and sort of peer out and look both ways just to make sure that it was clear. And that wasn't just me, that was people in my office. No one should have to do that after putting in an honest day's work. So I would just encourage people to remember how much pressure we're under. If you have questions, come to us. We all love talking about this stuff. Why would you not take the opportunity to engage with somebody who really and truly loves what they do, and I love what I do.
With thanks to the Carter Center and the Baker Institute, I'll conclude with this thought, and this is to the Netflix development hive. There's a very popular series of movies, Marvel movies, Guardians of the Galaxy. These are three guardians of democracy. Listen to them, pay attention to them. Give them a round of applause, for goodness sake.